We're back. We are finished with our research and we have a pretty good idea of what we're hoping to accomplish, but we are going to really make that clear in this step of the presentation. So we are going to work on our specific purpose statement and our thesis statements in this video. Let's take a look at what the assignment says about your specific purpose statement and your thesis statement. Now, you've done a specific purpose statement before. This one's going to be worded a little bit differently because this is a persuasive speech. And so your specific purpose is either to get your audience to agree with you or to get them to actually do something. And the way you phrase your specific purpose statement changes based on what your goal is. So if you want the audience to just agree with you, you're going to phrase your specific purpose statement using the word that. I want my speech to persuade my audience that. I want them to accept something, that nuclear power is better than solar power, that the government should increase its efforts to counteract global warming. Now, if you want them to do something, you're going to phrase it with to. I want my speech to persuade my audience to. I want them to get trained in CPR, to become Peace Corps volunteers, to stop using plastic bags. There are any number of things that you could be asking your audience to do. Knowing what you're hoping to accomplish, gaining agreement, or encouraging action is going to help you decide how to approach the rest of your speech. And that also helps you determine what your thesis statement will be. Now, the thesis statements get a little more complicated with persuasive speeches because we really think of the thesis statement clearly as a claim. You could also think of a claim as a proposition. I'm making this proposition to you and hoping that you will accept it. And so your book and just people in general talk about propositions when we're talking about persuasion. And there are three types of propositions that you might be advancing in your persuasive speech. So your proposition or your claim tells the audience what you're asking them to accept. Claims answer the question, what are you trying to prove? And there are three types of propositions: propositions of fact, propositions of value, and propositions of policy. Propositions of fact are not, a lot of people are like, well, a fact is a fact. Well, yeah, sort of, but not always. So here's a proposition of fact. The Transportation Safety Administration does not make us safer. And so there is a significant amount of evidence that suggests that the TSA is what a lot of people sort of descriptively call security theater, that it doesn't actually make you safer, it just gives the appearance of making you safer. So you can make an argument about that, and that is a proposition of fact. There's also the proposition of fact, video game violence causes real world violence. I have to say, I think the evidence is coming down pretty clearly on the side of this not being true. It doesn't actually do that, but that's a proposition of fact. A proposition of value asks the audience to make a judgment about some topic, whether it's right or wrong, moral or immoral. If you're asking the audience to accept that one thing is better than another, that Chevy's better than Ford, that's actually a proposition of value. So it could be something as deeply emotional as whether you should spank your children. It is wrong to spank your children, or it is better to live together before marriage. Or it could be something simpler like the Chevy Silverado is a better vehicle than the Ford F-150. Those are both propositions of value. And then you could have a proposition of policy. Your key word with policy is generally the word should. The word should implies that some action should be taken. So I want my speech to persuade my audience that blank should do blank. So the United States should implement federal mandatory parental leave policies, or you should brush your teeth at least twice a day. Now, what does that do for us? What does the proposition, knowing what we're trying to prove, do for us? Well, it helps us figure out how to put the rest of the speech together. If you take a look at your textbook, this is chapter 16. The first thing that it talks about in this chapter, well, one of the first things, is the different types of propositions. And you can go through and read the discussion of the propositions and how they work. But what I really want you to notice is there is a paragraph in each of these sections that tells you what you need to do in your speech if you're making this type of proposition. So for a proposition of fact, it says you need to make sure that your speech contains sufficient evidence to back up your proposition. So propositions of fact focus almost solely on the evidence. And so you must have impeccable research, credible sources, and you must be representing the evidence accurately. You need to take time to interpret the evidence so that it makes sense to your audience and emphasize the relationship between your evidence and your proposition, as well as its relevance to the audience. So if you're making a proposition of fact, it's all about the evidence. Let's look at what your text says about propositions of value. It talks about different kinds, but if you come over here, it says, since propositions of value tend to be more subjective, speakers need to establish evaluation criteria. Okay, so this is the key to your persuasion in a proposition of value. You have to tell the audience, what criteria are we using to evaluate these options? So let's say that you're saying that OU is a better college than UT. Well, what are the evaluation criteria we're using? Are we using average salary of graduates upon 5 years out? Are we using student life experience? There are any number of ways that we could evaluate these two colleges. You have to establish how you will evaluate the colleges so that you can be persuasive. When you are advancing a proposition of value, offer a clear set of criteria, evidence for evaluation, and apply the evidence to demonstrate that you have satisfied the evaluation criteria. So in a way, this is a proposition of fact plus one. It's evidence plus evaluation criteria, okay? Now, let's take a look at propositions of policy. Again, we have a discussion of the propositions of policy, but here we have a clue as to how you will put this together. When answering a proposition of policy, you have to begin by describing the status quo. That is, you have to tell us how things are now and the problem with those things before you move to how things should be. If you just jump into how things should be, you're missing an essential step in your reasoning process, and you're not going to be persuasive. Okay, if you're arguing that a change must be made, you must first identify the problem inherent in the current behavior. That's the status quo. And then demonstrate that the problem is significant enough to warrant immediate consideration. Once you have established that there's a problem, the audience is convinced that they should consider it, then you offer your proposal for a different course of action. It's up to you to demonstrate that the proposed policy will have more benefits than costs. And a lot of times, the problem with a proposition of policy is not that it's not a great idea. The problem is, how are you going to pay for it? Yes, it would be wonderful for every American school child to have a personal tutor. That would absolutely guarantee an improvement in learning, but how are you going to pay for it? And if you want to know what I'm thinking when you are talking in your speeches, generally what I'm thinking is, how are you going to pay for it? So if you're making a proposition of policy, generally there's going to be a cost associated with it. You need to make sure that you're demonstrating that the benefits of adopting the policy will outweigh the costs. Okay, so there's propositions of fact, value, and policy, and we talked about how to phrase your specific purpose statement. There is nowhere that I'm going to ask you to turn that information in for a grade. So you have to choose to do it. But I will tell you this, if you will know what you're hoping to accomplish every time you speak, you will be a more successful speaker. So just take the time to go through this thought process and really identify what you're hoping to accomplish. Up next, we will talk about persuasive outlines. Mostly, I will just cover the 2 new elements of the introduction because everything else looks pretty similar to what you've already done. Good luck. Contact me with your questions.